The lecture hall was full of noise. Young Pelori cadets sat in their curved seats, their forearms folded across their scaled chests, talking and laughing like they owned the galaxy. They were fresh out of basic training, strong, confident, and deeply stupid in the way that only the young and untested could be. Rovik stood at the front of the hall, leaning on his cane, and waited. He was old now. His green scales had faded to a dull gray along his jaw and neck. Two of his forearms moved slower than the others, damaged by injuries that never fully healed. He had been a soldier for 40 years, and a lecturer for 10, and every new class was the same: loud, arrogant, unaware. A cadet named Tuveen sat in the front row, grinning wide enough to show all 3 rows of his teeth. He leaned over to the cadet beside him and said loud enough for the whole room to hear, "I heard this semester we study the humans. What a waste of time. Soft skin, weak bones, no claws, no venom. They are prey animals pretending to be soldiers." Several cadets laughed. A few clapped their lower hands together in agreement. Rovik said nothing. He simply reached up with his 2 good arms and pulled open the front of his lecture robe. Underneath, running from his left shoulder all the way down to his right hip, was a scar. It was deep, wide, and ugly. The scales around it had never grown back. The skin beneath was pale and rough, like the surface of a dried riverbed. The laughter stopped. "I got this," Rovik said quietly, "from a human who was missing an arm. His name was Tejo, and I am going to tell you about the day I learned what humans really are." He let the silence hold for a moment, then began. It was the Battle of Arion Ridge. Rovik was young then, a junior lieutenant in the Pelori Dominion's shock infantry. The war against the human Creevy Alliance was supposed to be simple. Arion 4 was a border world, dry and rocky, with gravity 20% stronger than standard. The Pelori High Command had sent a full assault force to take a mountain pass held by a small human garrison. The numbers were overwhelming. 15 Pelori soldiers for every 1 human. It was not supposed to be a battle. It was supposed to be a footnote. They bombarded the pass for 6 hours. Plasma artillery turned the rocks to glass. Dust clouds rose so high they blotted out the local sun. When the bombardment ended, Rovik and his squad moved forward through the haze, weapons ready, expecting to step over bodies. Instead, they found Sergeant Tejo. He was standing in the rubble with 30 human soldiers spread across the shattered ridge behind him. Their uniforms were torn and burned. Several had blood running down their faces. One soldier near the back had a piece of metal sticking out of his thigh and was leaning on his rifle like a crutch. But every single one of them had their weapons raised. Not one had retreated. Not one had run. Rovik remembered the feeling that went through him in that moment. It was not fear, not exactly. It was confusion. Deep, uncomfortable confusion. Because every tactical model, every simulation, every lecture he had ever received told him that a force this small, hit this hard, should have broken, should have scattered, should have surrendered. They had not. The Pelori charged, and what followed was 14 hours of the worst ground fighting Rovik had ever experienced. The humans fought like they had forgotten they could die. One soldier, a sniper named Minho, had been buried under a collapsed watchtower during the bombardment. His spine was fractured. He could not stand. So he dragged himself onto a pile of broken stone, propped his rifle on the rubble, and continued shooting. He killed 11 Pelori soldiers from that position before someone finally reached him. When they did, he pulled the pin on a grenade and took 3 more with him. Rovik saw things that day that he could not explain with biology or training. He saw a human woman with a broken arm reload her weapon by holding it between her knees and pulling the charging handle with her teeth. He saw a human private, barely old enough to grow facial hair, pick up a fallen Pelori shield twice his weight and use it to bash through a defensive line. He saw humans bleeding, limping, crawling, and none of them, not a single one, ever moved backward. And then there was Tejo. Rovik's unit pushed through to the center of the ridge around the 9th hour. That was where Tejo was holding the line with the last of his squad. A plasma bolt hit Tejo's left arm just above the elbow. The arm came off. It simply came off, cauterized and smoking, and fell into the dust at his feet. Rovik expected him to fall, to go into shock, the way any rational creature would when it lost a limb in the middle of combat. Tejo looked down at his missing arm. Then he looked up. He pulled a heated blade from his belt, pressed it against the stump to seal the wound, and picked up his rifle with his remaining hand. He did not scream. He grunted once, short and sharp, like it was an inconvenience. Then he started walking forward. Rovik met him in close combat moments later. Rovik was bigger, stronger. He had 4 arms and claws that could tear through light armor. By every measure, the fight should have been over in seconds. It lasted 4 minutes, the longest 4 minutes of Rovik's life. Tejo hit him with a headbutt that cracked 2 of his ribs. He drove his knee into Rovik's midsection so hard that Rovik's vision went white. And then with one arm, bleeding from a dozen wounds, Tejo pulled his combat blade and slashed Rovik across the chest in a single, vicious arc. The cut went through scales, through muscle, almost to the bone. Rovik went down. He lay in the dirt, gasping, staring up at the dust-choked sky, and listened to Tejo keep fighting somewhere nearby. Still fighting, still moving forward, with one arm and half his blood in the sand. The Pelori took the ridge eventually. It cost them over 400 soldiers to kill 30 humans. When it was over, Rovik sat among the bodies of his fallen comrades and looked at the human dead. Not one of them had fallen facing away from the enemy. Not one of them had tried to run. Rovik stopped talking. The lecture hall was silent. Every cadet was staring at him. Tuvin's grin was gone. His mouth was slightly open, and his upper hands were gripping the edge of his desk. "We took that ridge," Rovik said. He tapped his cane against the floor once. "But we did not win, because by the time we held it, there was nothing left of us worth calling an army. That is all it took to break us. Not because they were stronger, not because they were faster, but because they simply refused to stop." He looked directly at Tuvin. "You called them prey animals. Prey animals run, cadet. These humans did not run. They made us pay for every single grain of sand on that ridge. And the price was so high that the Dominion never tried to take a human position by ground assault again." He pulled his robe closed over his scar. "That is what humans do. They do not need claws. They do not need venom. They have something worse. They have will, and it does not break." He turned toward the door, then paused. "Same time tomorrow. I will tell you about the medic." He walked out, and behind him, no one made a sound. The cadets were quieter the next day. That was the first thing Rovik noticed. The second thing he noticed was that Tuvin was sitting in the front row again, but this time he was not grinning. His forearms were crossed tight against his chest, and his eyes followed Rovik from the moment the old veteran stepped through the door. Good. Fear was the beginning of wisdom. Rovik set his cane against the podium and looked out over the hall. A few cadets shifted in their seats. One near the back raised a hand. "Sir," the cadet said, "are all humans fighters? Are there no normal ones among them?" Rovik let out a low sound that was not quite a laugh. It was dry and tired, the sound of someone who had been asked a foolish question too many times. "Let me tell you something," he said. "In 40 years of war, the human who scared me the most was not a soldier. She was not a commando, or a sniper, or a pilot. She was a medic. Her name was Yuna, and she was the most dangerous person I have ever seen." He gripped the edges of the podium with his 2 good hands, and began. It was the siege of Outpost Vela, on a frozen moon called Vela 7. The moon was small, cold, and miserable. Temperatures dropped to 60 below at night. The air was thin enough that most species needed breathing assistance. The Pelori Dominion was advancing across the sector, and a small human medical outpost had been caught behind the lines during a rapid push. The outpost held about 40 wounded human soldiers and a handful of staff. No heavy weapons, no armored vehicles, just beds, medical supplies, and one combat medic named Yuna. Rovik's unit was ordered to capture the outpost. Intelligence believed the humans inside had important tactical data. The mission was rated as low threat. A quick breach, a short fight, and they would move on. They breached the outer wall just after midnight. The first corridor was dark and cold. The heating system had failed hours earlier, and ice had started forming on the walls. Rovik led the way with 12 soldiers behind him, their thermal sensors scanning for movement. They found nothing at first, just empty hallways and the smell of antiseptic. Then they turned a corner, and there she was. Yuna stood in the middle of the hallway. She was small, even by human standards, a head shorter than most of her own species. She wore a medic's uniform that was stained with blood. Not her blood, but the blood of her patients. Her hands were at her sides. She was not armed. She looked at the 13 Pelori soldiers standing in front of her, all armed, all armored, all twice her size, and she said in clear, calm Galactic common, "You are not getting to my patients." Rovik almost laughed. Almost. But something in the way she said it stopped him. There was no fear in her voice, no panic, no desperation. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the same tone a person might use to say the sky is blue or water is wet. Then, the floor exploded. The first trap was a chemical mine built from surgical disinfectant and a heating element. It released a cloud of vapor that burned through Pelori scales on contact. 3 soldiers went down screaming, clawing at their faces. By the time the cloud cleared, Yuna was gone. What followed was 2 days of horror inside that small outpost. Yuna had spent the hours before the breach turning the building into a maze of death. She had rigged every hallway, every door, every ventilation shaft. Electrical traps built from defibrillator units, pressure plates connected to oxygen tank explosions, tripwires made from surgical thread, nearly invisible to Pelori eyes, attached to fragmentation charges built from broken medical equipment. She moved through the outpost like a ghost. One moment, she was on the second floor, treating a soldier whose chest wound had reopened. The next, she was in the basement, triggering a trap that collapsed a stairway onto a Pelori fire team. She carried her squad leader, Jisok, on her back between positions. Jisok had lost both legs below the knee in the fighting before the siege. He weighed more than Yuna did. She carried him anyway, running through frozen hallways with him across her shoulders, because he could still shoot a rifle, and she was not going to leave anyone behind. Rovik saw her once through a doorway during the first night. What he saw stayed with him for the rest of his life. She was standing over a wounded human, her hands deep inside his chest cavity, holding a torn artery together with her bare fingers. At the same time, with her other hand, she was firing a stolen Pelori sidearm through the doorway at a squad trying to breach the room. Her eyes were wide open, pupils so large they had turned almost entirely black. She was breathing in short, controlled bursts, and her hands, the same hands that were keeping a man alive, did not shake. She was in what humans called an adrenaline state. Rovik had read about it in the intelligence briefings, but reading about it and seeing it were two very different things. The human body, under extreme stress, could flood itself with a cocktail of chemicals, adrenaline, cortisol, endorphins, that temporarily elevated strength, speed, pain tolerance, and reaction time to extraordinary levels. It was a survival mechanism left over from their evolutionary past, when they were prey animals running from predators on a brutal, unforgiving world. For most galactic species, that level of chemical exposure would cause cardiac failure within minutes. For humans, it could last hours. And Yuna rode that wave for 2 full days. She did not sleep. She did not eat. She moved between treating patients and killing Pelori soldiers with a fluidity that seemed almost mechanical. She stitched wounds with one hand and set explosive traps with the other. She whispered comfort to dying soldiers, and then walked into the next room and put a plasma bolt through a Pelori helmet. There was no separation in her mind between healing and killing. Both were tools to protect her people, and she used both with equal skill. By the end of the second day, Rovik had lost 17 soldiers inside that outpost. 17 trained, armored Pelori shock troops, killed by a medic. When human reinforcements finally broke through and reached the outpost, they found Yuna standing in the main ward, surrounded by her 40 patients, all of them alive. She had kept them all alive through 2 days of siege, in a frozen building while fighting an enemy force alone. She looked at the rescue team, said, "They all need evacuation, prioritize the chest wounds," and then her legs gave out. She collapsed on the floor, not from any wound, but because her body had simply used up everything it had. The adrenaline was gone. The chemicals had burned through her system and left nothing but exhaustion. The Pelori medical team studied her vitals after the battle, pulled from monitoring equipment the humans left behind. Her heart had been running at over 200 beats per minute for nearly 30 straight hours. Her blood cortisol levels were high enough to dissolve Pelori's stomach lining. Her muscle fibers showed signs of micro-tearing from sustained overexertion. By every medical standard the Pelori knew, she should have been dead. She made a full recovery in 6 weeks. The lecture hall was completely still. The cadet who had asked the question looked pale, or at least as pale as a Pelori could look. His scales had gone from deep green to a washed-out gray. Her job, Rovik said slowly, was to heal. She swore an oath to protect life. And she was more lethal than any warrior I have ever faced in 40 years of combat. Not because she wanted to kill. She did not enjoy it. She did not celebrate it. He leaned forward on the podium. She did it because those were her people lying on those tables. Broken, bleeding, dying. And she decided that nothing in the universe, not cold, not exhaustion, not an army of Pelori soldiers, was going to take them from her. He straightened up. Every species in this galaxy fights for territory, for resources, for pride. Humans fight for each other. And when they fight for each other, there is no force in the known universe that can stop them. He picked up his cane. "Tomorrow, I will tell you about the tunnels. I suggest you do not eat beforehand." He walked out, and behind him, the silence was so heavy, it felt like gravity had doubled. On the third day, fewer cadets sat near the doors. Rovik noticed that most of them had moved toward the center of the hall, clustered together like herd animals sensing a predator nearby. Tuveen was in the front row again, but he had brought a recording device this time. His hands were steady, but his tail, the part of a Pelori that never learned to lie, was curled tight around the leg of his chair. A cadet near the middle raised a shaking hand. "Sir," she said, "is there a way to predict human behavior, to find a pattern, something we could use to prepare?" Rovik looked at her for a long time. Then he shook his head, slowly, deliberately. "No," he said, "and that is the worst part. You cannot predict them. You cannot model them. You think you have them figured out, and then they do something so insane, so completely outside anything you have ever imagined, that your entire understanding collapses. Let me tell you about the tunnels of Greth." He did not grip the podium this time. He sat down on the edge of the stage, like a tired old man telling a story by a fire, and the cadets leaned in without realizing they were doing it. Greth Prime was a mining world. Most of its value was underground, in a network of tunnels and caverns that stretched for hundreds of kilometers beneath the surface. When the Pelori Dominion launched its orbital bombardment, the human garrison on Greth Prime did exactly what the Pelori expected. They retreated underground. The Dominion commanders smiled when they received the report. The humans were trapped, they said. Cut off from supply lines, from reinforcements, from sunlight. It was only a matter of time before they starved or surrendered. Rovik was given the order to lead a sweep team into the tunnels and flush them out. He took 200 soldiers and enough equipment to hold the underground for a week. He expected a short, ugly fight against desperate, starving humans hiding in the dark. What he got instead was the worst 11 days of his life. The first sign that something was wrong came within the first hour. Rovik's team moved through the main entrance shaft in a standard formation. Thermal sensors active, weapons hot. The tunnel was wide enough for 4 Pelori to walk side by side. It was also completely dark. The humans had destroyed every light source, every lamp, every emergency beacon, every reflective surface. The darkness was total. That alone was not unusual. The Pelori had infrared vision. They could see heat signatures in complete darkness. It was, in fact, one of their greatest tactical advantages. Rovik was not concerned. Then his point man reported that the walls were wrong. They were coated in something, a thick, dark paste that smelled like rotting vegetation. It was not until the second day that they realized the humans had harvested a local cave fungus, processed it into a thermal masking compound, and smeared it on every surface in the tunnel network. The paste absorbed and scattered infrared radiation. It made the walls, the floor, the ceiling, and anything covered in it completely invisible to Pelori thermal vision. The humans had taken away their eyes. That was when the first soldier disappeared. Private Kellen was walking at the rear of the column. One moment he was there. The next he was gone. No sound, no scream, no struggle, just a gap in the formation where a soldier used to be. They found his weapon 20 meters back, lying on the ground, still warm. They never found Kellen. Over the next 3 days, 14 more soldiers vanished the same way. Silent, clean, impossible. The Pelori began walking in tighter formations, gripping each other's arms, jumping at every sound. Morale collapsed faster than Rovik had ever seen. These were trained soldiers, veterans of multiple campaigns, and within 72 hours, they were behaving like frightened children. And then the music started. It came from everywhere, echoing through the tunnels, bouncing off the coated walls, impossible to locate. It was human music, distorted, slowed down, played at frequencies that vibrated in the Pelori chest cavity and made their hearts stutter. Between the songs, there were whispers, words in the Pelori language, spoken with a human accent, saying things like, "We can see you, and you should not have come down here. And how many are you now? Count again." The humans had hacked the Pelori communication frequencies. A field engineer named Youngji had cracked the encryption using equipment salvaged from the mining operations and was broadcasting directly into the Pelori helmet speakers. She changed the messages every few hours. Sometimes it was laughter. Sometimes it was silence, which was somehow worse, because the silence meant they were planning something. The traps were everywhere. They were primitive but devastating. Punji-style pits dug into the tunnel floor, lined with sharpened mining stakes, coated in chemical irritant. Tripwire explosives, made from mining charges and scrap metal. Pressure-activated cave-ins, rigged to collapse specific tunnel sections. False floors, false walls, dead ends that became kill boxes. The man behind the traps was a Spec Ops demolitions expert named Dongwu. Rovik never saw him during the entire 11 days, not once. But he felt his presence everywhere. Dongwu moved through the tunnels like he was part of them, appearing and disappearing through routes that the Pelori maps did not show. Every crack, every side passage, every ventilation shaft. He had mapped the entire network in the days before the Pelori entered, and he used that knowledge with surgical precision. On the 5th day, Dongwu triggered a cascade detonation. He had spent 3 days planting charges along a 2-kilometer section of tunnel that a Pelori armored column was using as a supply route. When the column was fully inside, he blew the charges in sequence, starting from both ends and working inward. The tunnel collapsed like a closing fist. 200 Pelori soldiers were buried alive. The rumble lasted for nearly a minute, and when it stopped, the only sound was dust settling. Rovik heard Dongwu's voice on the hacked communication channel a few minutes later. He was humming, a soft, casual tune, like a man doing chores on a quiet afternoon. On the 7th day, Unji hacked a Pelori combat drone that had been sent into the tunnels for reconnaissance. She turned it against its own operators. The drone flew back down the main shaft, broadcasting a message in Unji's voice, cheerful and bright. "Thanks for the hardware. We made some improvements. Hope you don't mind." The drone's weapons were armed. It killed 8 soldiers before they managed to bring it down. On the 9th day, Rovik's team entered a large cavern, one of the main mining chambers, hoping to regroup and establish a defensive position. The cavern was silent, dark. The thermal masking paste covered everything. They could see nothing but each other. And then they heard laughter. It came from every direction. Not frightened laughter, not hysterical laughter. It was calm, relaxed, and amused. The kind of laughter that comes from people who are genuinely enjoying themselves. It echoed off the cavern walls and filled the space until it felt like the darkness itself was laughing. Rovik felt something break inside his soldiers. He felt it break inside himself. Because he suddenly understood something terrible. The humans were not trapped down here with them. The Pelori were trapped down here with the humans. They withdrew on the 11th day. Rovik gave the order himself. He had lost over 600 soldiers. His force was shattered, mentally and physically. The survivors flinched at shadows and could not sleep without lights on for months afterward. When the intelligence report came back, Rovik read it 3 times because he could not believe it. The entire human force in the tunnels, the force that had destroyed a 200-soldier armored column, hacked their drones, made their communications useless, and drove 600 Pelori soldiers out of the underground, consisted of 8 people. 8 humans, Dongwu, Unji, and 6 others. 8. Rovik stood up from the edge of the stage. His hands were trembling. He gripped his cane to steady them, but the cadets could see it. The old veteran, the survivor of a dozen wars, was shaking from the memory. 8 humans, he said. 8 humans held off an army in the dark, and they were laughing. Not from madness, not from desperation. They were laughing because they were having fun. He looked out at the cadets. Every face was pale. Every tail was curled tight. Every species in this galaxy has a survival instinct. When threatened, you fight or you run. Humans have a third option. They adapt. They take your strengths and turn them into weaknesses. They take their own weaknesses and turn them into weapons. And when they have finished reshaping the battlefield to their advantage, they do not just fight, they enjoy it. He started walking toward the door. Tomorrow, I will tell you about the pilot. She flew into a sun, and she smiled when she did it. Behind him, a cadet near the back quietly got up and turned on every light in the room. On the 4th day, the cadets were already seated when Rovik arrived. There was no talking, no laughter, no casual chatter about weekend plans or training scores. They sat in their seats, like soldiers, awaiting a briefing they knew would bring bad news. Even the lights in the hall seemed dimmer, though Rovik suspected that was just his old eyes. He walked to the podium slowly. His leg was worse today. The cold weather on Pallor Prime always made the old injuries ache. and there were so many old injuries that his entire body felt like a catalog of pain on days like this. He set his cane down and looked at the cadets. A young one near the middle, small, barely old enough for the academy, raised her hand. Her voice was quiet. "Sir," she said, "have you ever seen a human give up?" Rovik did not answer immediately. He looked down at his hands, all four of them resting on the podium, and was quiet for a long time. Long enough that some of the cadets glanced at each other, wondering if he had heard the question. "Once," he said finally. But it was not surrender. It was not defeat. It was something else entirely. Something I still dream about. And I do not think I will ever stop. He closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them. Her name was Samin, and she was the bravest person I have ever known. Not the bravest human, the bravest person of any species, in any war, in any age. The Battle of the Korath Expanse took place in open space near a dying star. The star was old and swollen, bleeding radiation in great waves that made sensors unreliable and shields unstable. It was a terrible place to fight. That was exactly why the combined alien fleet had chosen it. The target was a human colony ship called the Dawning. It was enormous, nearly 3 kilometers long, and it carried 200,000 human civilians, families, children, elders, people who had never held a weapon in their lives, traveling to a new settlement on the far side of the sector. The war had cut across their route, and now a fleet of 300 warships sat between them and safety. The colony ship's military escort had been destroyed in an ambush 2 days earlier. Only one wing of fighters remained, 13 ships, led by Wing Commander Samin. Rovik was not present for this battle. He learned about it afterward, from intercepted communications, battle recordings, and the testimony of Allied officers who witnessed it from a distance. But the recordings were enough. They were more than enough. Samin's voice was the first thing on the recordings. She was speaking to her pilots on a closed channel, and her tone was calm, almost conversational, like she was discussing the weather rather than the end of the world. "All right, listen," she said. "The jump drive needs 20 minutes to charge. We have 13 fighters and 300 enemy ships between us and those 20 minutes. The math is not good. I am not going to pretend it is. But those people behind us did not ask for this war, and they are not going to die because of it. Not today." She paused. When she spoke again, her voice was steady and warm. "You all know what I am asking. I am not ordering it. This is volunteer only." There was a brief silence on the channel. Then, one by one, every pilot responded. 12 voices, each saying the same thing in their own way. "Yes, I am in. Let us go." Samin said, "Then let us buy them 20 minutes." 13 human fighters flew directly into a fleet of 300 warships. Not to win. There was no winning. They flew in to die slowly, and to make their dying cost the enemy as much time as possible. Samin was a genius in the cockpit. She used the dying star's gravity well to slingshot her fighters at speeds that should have torn them apart. She flew through the gaps in enemy capital ships, so close that their point defense guns could not track her without hitting their own hulls. She used the star's radiation bursts as cover, timing her attacks to coincide with sensor blackouts that blinded the enemy for precious seconds. Her pilots followed her lead. They were not the best equipped fighters in the galaxy. Their ships were older models, designed for patrol, not fleet combat. But they flew them like instruments, every maneuver precise, every second counted and spent with purpose. Nari, the communications officer aboard the colony ship, monitored the battle from the Dawning's bridge. She kept the channel open so the civilians could not hear, but she listened to everything, every order, every confirmation, every goodbye. The first pilot fell at minute 3. His name was Byung-ho. His fighter took a direct hit from a plasma lance, and his ship broke apart in a silent flash of light. Somin's voice came over the channel immediately. "Byung-ho, fly well." Then she adjusted the formation and kept going. The second and third fell at minute 5. Twin brothers, Junwoo and Sungwoo, flying side by side, as they always had. They drew fire from a destroyer group, long enough for Somin to knock out its sensor array. When their ships were hit, they went together. Somin said their names, "Fly well." By minute 10, half the wing was gone. 6 pilots dead, 7 remaining. The enemy fleet had been slowed, but not stopped. The warships were closing on the colony ship, and the jump drive was only halfway charged. Somin changed tactics. She ordered her remaining pilots to target the enemy's communication relays, forcing the fleet to switch to backup systems, and creating confusion in their coordination. The enemy advance slowed further, ships bumping into each other's firing lanes, captains shouting over jammed frequencies. By minute 15, 3 pilots remained, Somin and 2 others. The colony ship needed 5 more minutes. The enemy flagship, a massive dreadnought at the center of the fleet, was pushing through the chaos, heading straight for the dawning. If it reached firing range, the colony ship was dead. At minute 17, the 2 remaining pilots flew directly into the dreadnought's fighter screen. They took out a dozen interceptors and damaged a gun battery before they were destroyed. Somin said their names. "Fly well." She was alone. 3 minutes on the clock. 1 fighter, 1 pilot, 1 dreadnought between her and 200,000 lives. Somin opened a channel to Nari on the colony ship. Her voice was still calm, still warm, but there was something else in it now. The kind of softness that comes when a person has made peace with something enormous. "Nari," she said, "when you get to the settlement, find my daughter. Her name is Yujin. She is 7 years old, and she is probably driving her grandmother insane right now." Nari's voice cracked. "Commander, please, tell her I chose this," Somin said. "Tell her that I thought about it, really thought about it, and I would choose it again, every time. Tell her that her mother loved her more than the stars, and that is exactly why I am doing this." Then she cut the channel. Somin aimed her fighter at the dreadnought's reactor core. She pushed her engines past their safety limits, past the red lines, past the point where the hull began to glow. Her ship was shaking itself apart around her, and the battle recordings showed that her hands on the controls were perfectly steady. She hit the dreadnought at full speed. It tore through the reactor, split the ship in half, and sent a shockwave through the surrounding fleet that knocked a dozen ships out of formation. The flagship was gone. The fleet's command structure collapsed. Captains scrambled for new orders that never came. The jump drive hit full charge 18 seconds after the explosion. The colony ship jumped. 200,000 humans vanished into faster-than-light travel, alive and safe, hurtling toward a new home that Somin would never see. 13 pilots, 20 minutes, 200,000 lives. Rovik stopped talking. The hall was silent, but it was a different kind of silence than the days before. This was not the silence of fear. It was something deeper. Several cadets had tears running down their scaled faces. One in the back had his head in all 4 of his hands. Even Tuveen, who had started this week mocking humans as weak and worthless, was sitting perfectly still, and the light caught something wet on his cheek. Rovik's own voice was barely a whisper when he spoke again. "Every species in this galaxy values survival above all else. It is the first law of nature. It is rational. It is logical. Self-preservation is the foundation of every civilization we know." He paused. "Humans do not follow that law. Humans value each other above themselves. A mother will fly into a warship for children she has never met. A pilot will die smiling if it means strangers get to live. They do not see sacrifice as loss, they see it as purpose. He looked at the cadets with eyes that had seen too much, and carried it all. And that is why you will never defeat them. You cannot conquer a species that considers dying for one another to be the highest honor a life can achieve. He picked up his cane. Tomorrow is the last story. It is the one that changed me. It is the one that changed everything. He walked out, and the silence he left behind felt like a cathedral. On the 5th day, the lecture hall was full in a way it had never been before. Word had spread through the academy. Cadets from other classes, from other years, had filled every seat, lined every wall, and crowded into the aisles. Instructors stood at the back, arms folded, watching. Even the academy commandant was there, sitting in the last row, saying nothing. Rovik walked in and stopped. He looked at the crowd and something moved across his old face. Surprise, maybe, or something sadder. He walked to the podium, set down his cane, and stood there for a long moment, just breathing. When he spoke, his voice was quieter than it had been all week. I have told you about their endurance, he said, their ferocity, their madness, their willingness to die for each other. 4 stories, each one more frightening than the last. But I saved the most terrifying story for the end, because this is the one that broke me. As a person. He lowered his head. This is the story of how the war ended. The final days of the human Pelori War were ugly. The Dominion had lost. Everyone knew it. The great fleet that had once controlled half the sector was scattered or destroyed. The colonies were falling one by one. And now, a human armada sat in orbit above Palor Prime, the homeworld, the heart of everything the Pelori had ever been. Rovik was a senior officer by then, old, scarred, tired of a war he had stopped believing in years earlier. He stood in the command chamber of the Pelori High Council, alongside his commanding officer, Scylla, and watched the tactical display with the rest of the leadership. The display showed the human fleet, hundreds of warships, arranged in a perfect sphere around their planet. No gaps, no weaknesses, total encirclement. Below them, the civilian population was starving. Supply lines had been cut for weeks. Hospitals were running out of medicine. Children were crying in shelters dug into the rock beneath the capital city, and their parents had nothing to give them. Everyone in the command chamber knew what was coming. Every species in galactic history that had won a war this decisively did the same thing. Orbital bombardment, subjugation, enslavement, or if the victor was feeling efficient, extinction. The Pelori had done it themselves to 3 other species during their expansion. It was the way of things. The strong destroyed the weak. That was the only law that mattered among the stars. Scylla assembled a delegation. Rovik was chosen because he had fought humans longer than anyone else alive, and understood their language and customs better than most. They boarded a shuttle and flew up to the human flagship, expecting to negotiate the terms of their annihilation. Rovik brought a small blade hidden in his belt. Not for fighting, for himself. He had decided that if the terms were extermination, he would rather die by his own hand than give the humans the satisfaction. The human flagship was called the Horizon. It was enormous, bristling with weapons that could level continents. Fleet Admiral Hyunwoo met the Pelori delegation in a conference room near the bridge. He was a tall man with gray at his temples and calm, dark eyes. His second-in-command, Lieutenant Hana, stood behind him, hands clasped, face unreadable. Hyunwoo gestured for the Pelori to sit. He sat across from them. The table between them was plain metal, undecorated. There were glasses of water for both sides. Rovik noticed that the water glasses were the same for humans and Pelori. The same size, the same quality. A small detail, but it unsettled him. Scylla spoke first. Her voice was controlled, but Rovik could see her tail trembling beneath the table. "Admiral Hyunwoo," she said, We are here to discuss terms. We understand the position we are in. We ask only that you are efficient. Our civilian population has suffered enough. She was asking for a quick death. Rovik closed his eyes. Hyunwoo was silent for a moment. Then he opened a folder on the table and slid a document across to Scylla. It was written in both human script and Pelori glyphs. These are our terms, he said. Scylla read the document. Rovik watched her face. He watched the confusion arrive first, then the disbelief, then something he had never seen on his commanding officer's face before. She looked up at Hyunwoo with wide eyes. I do not understand, she said. Hyunwoo's terms were as follows. Full military disarmament, war reparations paid over 50 years, political restructuring to remove the military council and establish civilian governance, an independent tribunal to try war criminals from both sides. And that was all. No orbital strikes, no occupation forces, no enslavement, no genocide, no forced labor camps, no cultural erasure, no re-education programs. Instead, the terms included provisions for immediate humanitarian aid, food shipments, medical supplies, engineering teams to restore power and water to Pelori cities, educational exchanges, diplomatic representation. The humans were not going to destroy them. The humans were going to help them. Scylla's hands were shaking so hard she could barely hold the document. She looked at Hyunwoo with an expression that Rovik had never seen before. Not on a Pelori, not on any species. It was raw, open confusion, the face of someone whose entire understanding of the universe had just been pulled out from under them. Why? She asked. Her voice cracked on the word. We killed your people. We burned your colonies. We killed your children. Millions of them. Why would you not destroy us? You have the power. You have the right. He looked at the table, then at his hands, then at Scylla. When he spoke, his voice was even and clear. Because we have been where you are, he said. Centuries ago, on our own world, we did to ourselves what you did to us. We burned our own cities. We killed our own children. We came so close to ending ourselves that the ashes of our mistakes are still buried in our soil. He leaned forward slightly. And we learned, in blood and fire, over generations, we learned that cruelty does not end cruelty. It only plants the seeds for more. Vengeance feels like justice, but it is not. It is just pain wearing a mask. He looked at Scylla directly. We are not doing this for you. We are doing this because of who we choose to be. Because the species we want to be does not burn worlds. Not even the worlds that burned ours. The room was silent. Rovik felt the hidden blade against his leg, and felt something he had not expected. Deep, nauseating shame that flooded through him like cold water. Because he realized in that moment that he had been fully prepared to die rather than accept mercy. And the humans were offering mercy he had never even imagined was possible. In the weeks that followed, Rovik watched the impossible happen. Human cargo ships descended through the atmosphere, carrying food, water, and medicine. Pelori children who had been eating ration paste for weeks were given real food by human soldiers who knelt down to their level and smiled, even though those same children's parents may have killed human families on distant worlds. Lieutenant Hana personally oversaw the relief effort in the capital city. Rovik learned later that Hana's older brother had been killed at the siege of Vela, the same outpost where Yuna had fought. Hana had every reason to hate the Pelori, every reason to want revenge. Instead, she walked through Pelori refugee camps and distributed blankets to shivering civilians with steady hands and a warm expression on her face. Rovik watched a human doctor treat a wounded Pelori soldier. The soldier had been injured in the final battle, fighting against the very fleet that was now saving him. The doctor cleaned his wounds, applied medication, and spoke to him in broken Pelori, smiling and saying things like, You are going to be fine, and hold still, this will sting a little. Something inside Rovik broke. Not like a bone breaks, sharp and sudden, like a dam breaks, slowly at first, then all at once, until everything he had built inside himself, every wall, every justification, every belief about how the universe worked, was swept away, and he was left standing in the wreckage with nothing but the truth. The truth was simple. The humans were better than them. Not stronger, not smarter, not more advanced. Better in the way that mattered most, in the choices they made when they held all the power and owed nothing to anyone. Rovik stopped talking. The lecture hall was so quiet he could hear the ventilation system humming in the walls. Every face was turned toward him. Some were crying. Some were staring with wide, unblinking eyes. The academy commandant in the back row had his head bowed. Rovik's own eyes were wet. He did not try to hide it. I have fought many species, he said. I have seen cruelty beyond imagination and courage beyond reason. But nothing in this galaxy terrified me more than the moment a human looked at me. After everything we had done, after all the death and suffering we had caused, and said, "Let us build something better." He took a breath. They could have burned our world. They had earned that right with the blood of millions. They had the weapons pointed and the fire ready, and they chose mercy. Not weakness, mercy. There is a difference, and if you learn nothing else from me, learn that. He picked up his cane and stepped away from the podium. So when you go out into the galaxy, cadets, and you meet a human, do not think of them as soft. Do not think of them as primitive. Do not think of them as short-lived animals with fragile bones and thin skin. Think of them as the species that will fight to the last breath, laugh in the face of death, fly into suns for strangers they have never met, and then, after all of that, offer you their hand and help you stand. He walked toward the door, slowly, his cane tapping on the floor. That is what makes them terrifying. That is what makes them beautiful, and that is why, in all my years of war, I am glad they won. He reached the door and stopped. Without turning around, he said, "Class dismissed." Behind him, Tuveen rose to his feet. The young cadet, who had started this week mocking humans as prey animals, stood at attention and raised his hand to his brow in a salute. Not a Pelori salute, the closed fist pressed to the chest. A human salute, the open hand raised to the temple, the one that meant respect. One by one, every cadet in the hall stood and followed, then the instructors, then the commandant. Rovik heard the rustling of hundreds of bodies rising behind him, and he paused in the doorway. He did not turn around, but his shoulders straightened just slightly, and he walked out into the light.